Hey everybody, and welcome to my deck talk presentation analysis. I don't know what you want to call it. I don't even know if I've done one of these before. I mean, obviously I did the coalition reviews, but this time around I just want to talk about my specific Redfor Unspec deck. You've seen, if you watched the recent videos, a lot of videos of, like, I don't know, past 2 weeks or something. I played a lot of this deck. I played a lot of Redfor Unspec, and I think I only read a few comments, but many of you who didn't comment may already be sick of it. And granted, over the past week I basically barely played any Wargame because I've gotten into Elder Scrolls Online. But anyways, I really like this deck. So I thought, since this isn't a deck that you see very often, you may see very often, or relatively often, Red for Mechanized, maybe even Armored. But I think Red for Unspec, and to the same extent Blue for Unspec, isn't something you see very often. And there's a good reason for that. So before we get into the specifics of my deck, I want to talk about Unspec first. So obviously, you only get 45 activation points. Nations get 60 activation points. That's 15 more activation points. That is mostly relevant for USSR, USA, and Israel. Maybe Yugoslavia, but it's generally not worth playing Yugoslavia over Entente. USSR and Israel obviously don't have coalition partners, so it's not like there's a choice. When it comes to USA and NORAD, I think both. I don't think there's a straight up objective better choice. It more depends on your playstyle. NORAD does, or Canada does, bring some nice extra units, but if you have that very Rifleman and Abrams centered playstyle where you get a lot of your actual kills with aerial units, and like, basically, let me put it this way: if you play like Putin plays his US deck, you probably get more out of these 5 extra activation points than you get by having access to the MXS, Eric's squads, and what have you. And then of course coalitions get 55 activation points, which is still plenty. But then that's still 10 more activation points than unspec decks get, or mixed red and mixed blue decks. They used to get 50 activation points back in the day before the Dutch German DLC. I think they got nerfed around one of the map pack patches when they added Crossroads, Snake Pit, Hell in a Very Small Place, Punch Bowl, you name it, Highway. That's when they got nerfed. Back then, let's go a bit back in time. Back then, the Q Marushiki was unprototyped and had 22 AP. I'm gonna be honest here. I was one of the people who heavily, if you want to call it that way, lobbied for a prototyped Q-Maru to 23 AP. Because back then, in my opinion, and I stand by that, mixed blue and to a lesser extent mixed red, but mostly mixed blue was just so meta, and there was really no huge point in playing the coalitions. Granted, back then I think the meta was not nearly as developed, and also the knowledge of units and mechanics wasn't nearly as developed as it is now. But I still think that it was a good choice, because I feel like the high-end unicorns and like should for the most part be prototype. But let's not get too far back, too far into that. Now you saw first it started with blue for Moto and then blue for Mech, and shortly after you also saw blue for Unspec and blue for Armored, both being centered around the Q-Maru. Blue for Unspec being kind of similar, but having access to motorized units. Sorry for that. Motorized units such as Eric's squads, which were unprototyped back then, etc., etc. But still, you mostly saw spec decks because 10 activation points or 5 activation points less were quite a big deal. And then they also got nerfed, with even though the Eric's got prototyped, the Q-Maru got prototyped, Jäger and Gewehrman got nerfed, Gewehrman 85 I should say. But they also got the activation points nerfed from 50 to 45. And then you basically saw no mixed unspec deck anymore. Granted, blue for unspec was kind of rare, but You know, it wasn't it obviously wasn't bad by any means, but that also nerfed mixed moto and mixed mech. But that basically meant that in order to save or to indirectly gain activation points, you had to play a spec deck. You know, since you get the reduction of deck costs in, for example, the infantry tab and the vehicle tab, or even also the recon tab when you're playing motorized, etc., right? And yeah, now we're here. So if you take a look at this deck, if you only get 10 activation points more, meaning a coalition, we could put in like 2 more tanks and a plane. And this is also already quite a big deal, because the main issue with having only 45 activation points and not also on top of that not a specialization is, once you cover the basics of your deck, and I've touched upon this a bit, but I want to get more into it in this video. Once you covered your basics, meaning your meat shield infantry, your guarding infantry, your tanks, your AA, your mortar, your recon infantry, your ASF, your anti-tank plane, etc. Once you cover those, you don't have any points left to put in niche units, flex units, and with flex I don't mean to flex on your opponent, but flexible units that you might only need on certain maps, on certain positions, or in certain situations against certain opponents, etc., right? But in this deck, basically everything is just for once. Nearly everything here is straightforward. I don't like, you know, someone pointed out, you know, the T55 recon is also not prototype, which I was actually aware of, contrary to the IDO 90. But the thing with the T55 recon, it's a very good unit, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't really fill an important gap in a deck. You know, it is strong, it is useful, it can get a lot of work done, but it's not a type of unit that you need to have in your deck, like recon infantry, like tanks, you know, depending on what tank, like ATGM infantry, like meat shield infantry, like CQC infantry, or infantry with heavy AT, or air superiority fighters, a mortar. Well, if you ask Putin doesn't even put a mortar into his US deck, but speaking for my playstyle for now, right? Or CVs, supply trucks, etc. You know, those are things that you have to have in your deck. Something like a high-end recon tank, as good as it is, it's not something you have to have. Now, obviously, if you play Entente or Yugoslavia, you want to put in your M84AN because it is a very good unit. But at the same time, since you have 55 activation points, it's not very hard to fit it into your deck. But try building an Entente deck or Yugoslav deck with 45 activation points, and you might still be able to fit it in, because it's such a great unit. But you will have to save the points somewhere else. You know, I can only put in 1 helicopter, only 4 planes, only 2 cards of tanks, only 3 recons. Especially 3 recon and 2 tanks is probably what is the most difficult part here. As you might have seen me play this without a FOB and without a Jurgen, and having a 4th recon card, mainly because I don't have the FOB anymore. You know, basically replace those and have a 3rd card of AA. But I feel that since I have only the very quote-unquote basics, you know, which isn't to say that the units I use are basic and underpowered. You know, if you look at the M84A, it's a ridiculously good tank. But I only have the things, you know, like I said, I don't have these niche and flex units, so I think I need the Jurgen and the FOB to have this kind of force multiplier, to have the Jurgen helps me push basically everywhere, because I don't have cheap direct fire support outside of the BVPs, for example. Maybe there's Crash It if you count that. So BVPs, however, as you saw maybe against TechB, struggle against stuff like non-anti-Jäger. And I don't have the activation points to put in something like a Bruskunmitsi in MI17, which, you know, or a Svedka in the MI17 to get it cheaper, you know, which you mainly put in to get a cheap MTV, which is a cheap, very effective fire support helicopter, which would in these scenarios be very useful. So this is why this deck covers basically all the basics that you need, and not a whole lot more. Alright, so that's 10 minutes covered as to, you know, why mixed red and what are its weaknesses. So not why mixed red, but, you know, what comes into what plays into building this deck, and also why you don't see this very often. Even though after seeing the videos, you might or might not, think this deck looks pretty good. Why do not more people play it? And I hope the explanation was or made sense to you. So going into the specific deck that I built, obviously, I hope it's obvious. In the future, if you see more videos of this, there might be a change in units here and there, and that happens with every deck. I constantly, try around new unit combinations, or sometimes I get bored of certain things. So that's why decks that I use are rarely always up to date in the deck spreadsheet that I made and update every couple of months. So but that is just normal, and that should hopefully be the case for basically every player. So yeah. Now, one big difference between mixed red and mixed blue is the M84A. That is the key unit for this deck. Again, I've said it before, but I want to emphasize this. In my opinion, the M84A is probably the only tank that can fill every role good enough. It's obviously not amazing at dealing with super heavies depending on the map, and it's obviously not amazing at being just a tank for your flanks because it's kind of expensive, but for both roles it's still good enough, it is amazing at dealing with mediums and even tanks slightly above its weight class, and obviously also tanks below its weight class, but still good and efficient enough at things much lower and much higher. Things that you'd expect to be dealt with by super heavies and things you'd expect to be dealt with by 30-point tanks, And that's why I think blue for mixed unspec is much harder to play. Unless you have a completely different playstyle that again revolves around A10s and such. But in that scenario, US unspec is just much better. The other aspect of Redfor unspec is that unlike blue mech, for example, you get a whole lot of units from different specialization. Blue mech gets basically nearly everything you need. You get the Hachinanas, you get the Merkavas, you get the Zeldas or the M113 spam, whatever you prefer. The KFVs, you get Chumat, you get Amex 10s even, you get the K1, you get obviously all the planes, which, every specialization that is in Marines does. Get all the great stuff. Nearly all the great units are available in mech. You don't really lose a whole lot. Obviously you lose your HA Abrams, which is a good tank, but not necessarily necessary. You still get the LRM, for example. You get your Ronins, you get your Gepards. You lose the Crotal, for example. There are obviously a couple of units you lose, but not a whole lot. So if you were to look at let's just take a look at infantry tab, what blue for unspec might or could look like in theory. Just very, very briefly. On one of these, you probably want a Merkava, or you might not, because you only get 5 slots and there's so much great. Let's get some cheap. And then last but not least, maybe some shock infantry, some Stormer. Now nearly everything here you also get in mech. The only difference is you don't get the Stormer and the XA186 NO, but you can get them in a 5-pointer, which isn't a great 5-pointer, but good enough. Or you could, if you wanted, you could get Commandos 90 in a 5-pointer, which is even a slightly better 5-pointer, and Commandos themselves are very great. And this is stuff that you all get in mech as well. Now, if we take a look at, as you can see, I have a lot of, I kept all of the old versions. Let's take a look at this. VV90, airborne and motorized. Proletariat 90, mechanized, armored, and motorized. Mechani Savannah, mechanized, armored, motorized. Alright, so they all have motorized as a common, spec, but what about the CSD? Marines and mechanized and armored. What was the last one? Support, probably. PvP, mech and armored. Tab 71, motorized, marines, support. Scratched, airborne. So we get airborne, moto, and mech in one. If I were to play mech, I wouldn't get VDV. I wouldn't get wheeled infantry. If I were to play moto, I wouldn't get the BVPs or discretion. And if I were to play armored, I also don't get VDV or discretion or the tab 71. So I lose out on key units, in my opinion. VDV 90 are a must-have because they themselves are just so good. I need wheeled infantry, at least for me, to be able to quickly reinforce something with infantry with that is also like good itself. A good itself meaning a decent enough MG and a good anti-tank weapon, which Proletary 90 fulfill quite well. Tab 71, not the best wheel transport, but the KPVT with a 20% base accuracy, you know, if we compare it to the BTR 70, for example, which has only 10, actually can sometimes do a good amount of damage. It obviously will get wrecked by AMX 10s and KTs, but don't underestimate this little thing. And if I were to play motorized, I wouldn't get this Sunshine in his CSD, for example. So there's stuff from all specs in this infantry tab, and they're all very important. That is why Unspec makes also sense in that case. And like I said, the M84A can fulfill all roles, so I can basically get away with quote-unquote only 2 tanks. 2 cards of tanks. Usually you'd rather see 3, sometimes even 4 cards. I would like to put in, for example, a Charioteer as well, but I don't have the activation points. I could, for example, remove the Polo, but the Polo is just... it's fucking Polo. But now, finally, for the 5th time, let's actually get into the specific units that I use. CCC, cheap, 3 per card, 2 top armor tank. If I want a tank that actually survives something, T72 might be a better case, because 3 back armor, 7 side armor means that if the artillery doesn't hit exactly top armor, especially HE artillery, your tank will survive more. However, at the same time, if I only use 2 CVs, I don't necessarily want to have one of those be 150 points. I think that's the cheapest T72 that you can get. Yeah. This is just more affordable. So I guess you could argue 15 points not a huge deal. Maybe you're right. Maybe I should use this, but I use this over the infantry CV because on certain maps, like for example highway or something, there isn't always a good or safe position for your infantry CV, and that being a town, so I don't want to lose a CV to a random MLRS track or something. So I want a somewhat durable CV that is also affordable. Then I use this one. I could use the USE. Is this the same as the USE, by the way? Yeah. I could use a USE for 10 points less. However, 50 kmh lower off-road speed, and trust me that off-road speed can help quite a lot to avoid artillery and the like. Don't underestimate that. Jesus, that thing is fast. Supply drug fob. I don't know if I've said this before, I probably have. If I use a fob, I much prefer the 20-point supply trucks. They are less point efficient and card efficient than the 30-point ones. However, 20 points allows you to, more easily buy a supply truck just to resupply an HGM squad or something, so you don't have to immediately pay 30 points for that. And then of course, 3 20-point supply trucks resupply faster than 2 30-point supply trucks, and point efficiency isn't an important factor when you have a fob. That is effectively irrelevant after the first or second trip to the fob and back to the front line. And then it's much more noticeable that you can spread out your supply across the front line, which is generally more useful. If I were not to run a fob, I would use the 30-point supply trucks, but since I run a fob, I much prefer the 20-point ones. I use these over the 15 or 10-point ones because of the off-road speed, especially the 10-point ones are very, very slow, and when you're driving through forests or something, that can really slow you down a lot. It should also be noted that the 30-point supply trucks have 1 front armor, not a huge deal, but 10 HP, which against mortar strikes can be quite useful. Now infantry. I did try out a VDV-90 in the MTV, but I felt that VDV-90 are way too useful to have them only available in helicopters. They're just so goddamn strong, especially highway in the middle, plunging valley in the mid. Basically everywhere that is like medium and close range for tanks, they're just so goddamn strong. I'm putting them in the discretion because for one, they're good fire support. Two, um, allows me to have a bunch of cheap AA around that for one can help deal chip damage or like a little amount of damage, 1, 2, maybe even 3 HP damage to planes for my OSAs or the IDA-90s to then potentially only need 1 shot to kill, and it allows me to spread around these cheap AA pieces across the map, use them as flying defense, base defense, etc. And since I can't put in or don't have the space to put in what's it called? The Type 80 25 points back anymore, they are a good gap filler for that, I guess. Proletariat 90 I've touched upon before. That is very useful. I tried out Panzery Yakari 90 before in the XA. However, I didn't find that I did find that paying 5 points more. Obviously they have 1 less AP. And I think their MG, I'm actually not certain which one is better because the KK has a longer burst length. So I think the KK might be a bit better. Has 1 less AP. But actually I also found that the KPVT with a 20% base accuracy for 5 points, I actually found that to be worth it, believe it or not. So that is actually a factor. Before I actually used the Panzery because they're 5 points cheaper, since I want them to be motorized. Now I actually am completely fine with paying the 5 points for the KPVT. Mechanische Rivana in the PvP, straightforward, I think. Very ridiculously strong IFP, good infantry. They have an SMG and their anti-tank weapon only has 525 meter range, but they do have an MG3, and again, you have the fucking PvP. It's just a obviously ridiculously strong infantry combination. I used to use the Yakari before, and the infantry themselves, I would probably... Alright, it doesn't. There. Infantry itself, I would probably still prefer, even though Putin, for example, said that he prefers the range on the RPG-7. However, it's actually the transport that made me choose the Sanchi or Shanshi over the Yakari because of the off-road speed. I definitely need the 5-pointer to be able to keep up with the infantry and the M84As, even though I never noticed that before, but I think that is very, very important because the infantry itself also isn't as important anymore, since I have other ways to also deal damage with the BVPs and the Eurogun and the M84As and the 5-pointer itself. So I found it more important that the 5-pointer itself, again, is faster. Also, 2 side armor actually is a noticeable deal. It's faster, amphibious, not a huge deal. Autonomy, also not really a huge deal, but mainly the off-road speed, really. And that is a huge difference. Conquerors M should be straightforward. I prefer them in a wheeled transport to, for one, get them fast to the front line, as opposed to, a 5-pointer, which is lower, of course, and not in an MTV, because it's useful to have, of course, but it often prevents you from putting them into spaces or houses and buildings and spots that are very, very close to the front line. So that's why I find these way too inflexible to put into MTVs. I don't think there's really anything else worth taking. I think I need all of these infantry. I did consider Leka Perota in the wheeled transport, I think, instead of Proletariat 90. But I want my wheeled infantry to be a jack of all trades. Good against infantry, be able to fight in CQC, meaning they have to be shock, and also be good against vehicles. And it's not the case for Leka Perota. I would like to fit them in, maybe even in the MI-17. So I actually do have an MI-17 in the deck, which I currently don't have. Especially with the FOB, very useful, since I can resupply them, of course. But I don't know what I should or could cut. I need the VDV-90 because they are just so great. I need the Proletariat 90 because I need wheeled infantry. I need these because they're also so good. And I need cheap mid-shield infantry. And I don't think I can I don't think I can skip on the Conquer Sam. You could argue that I have the Polo, but I don't think that's a good substitute. I think putting in a Lekka Perota for me, for my playstyle, would weaken the deck. Item 90. It's just a very good all-round infantry. Too much talk about infantry. Just a very good all-round anti-air piece. Since I basically have only 2 spots for AA, I also want one of these to be non-radar if possible. And the I-90, while a bit expensive, fills that slot very well. 8 missiles also means that compared to the HQ7, it is a lot more self-sufficient. If the HQ7 shot down 1 helicopter, there's a good chance that it has only 1, if you're lucky, 2 missiles left. And that is just way too dangerous. I don't like seeing that because that means that 2 helicopters, or potentially even 1 helicopter if you're unlucky, and the HQ7 might be dead, or the opponent could just roll you over with planes and something. So I much prefer basically paying 25 points for, 4 more missiles. But let's not forget it has 5% more accuracy. And also more range against planes. And that is not to ignore. That's actually quite noticeable, that 175 meter extra range. Don't ignore that. Definitely an upgrade worth having. And I don't mind having this expensive unit because I have the OSA AK for cheap AA, mostly against planes, but if it comes to it, it's good enough versus helicopters due to the HE. And usually I also have a couple of scratch hits around that, which means that I shouldn't really have major issues against helicopters if I don't have an I-290 around immediately. And I also have Illusor if it comes down to it. So, or if I buy the I-290 as my only proper AA piece, a single AA piece, even if it dies or if the map is a bit wider or I'm getting attacked on flanks, there's a good chance I have scratchers around that will at least, maybe not kill them, but at least just stop the enemy for a while and just hold them off while I can buy new AA and the like. So that is a very important addition to my anti-air tab effectively, even though it's in the infantry tab. Again, like I said, I tried to use it without a fob, but I feel it is just necessary. Effectively being a force multiplier, allowing me to push without the need of strong direct fire support. If I panic the enemy, a couple of VPPs or even just some 5-pointers is usually enough to help my infantry into pushing. And yeah, if you don't have all the flexible little units, the charioteers, the MTVs, stuff like that, I think having a strong MLRS is of utmost importance. And the Eurogun is probably, in my opinion, the best MLRS. It has a slightly lower splash radius than the LRM, however it has 4 more rockets. And most importantly, it has only 1 second of time between the individual rockets. I've said it before, but I'm gonna repeat it. Effectively, this means that it shoots, when it's shooting, it shoots 1 rocket, reloads for 1 second, shoots the next one, and so on and so on. For the LRM, it's 2 seconds, meaning that if you're a bit late on realizing the LRM is firing on you, you have bigger chance of being able to kind of avoid it, at least with your faster units. Mortar is pretty obvious. I prefer the 5 HE mortars because of their range, most importantly, over the 4 HE mortars or 3 HE. And also, if it comes down to having to use them to potentially kill something, 5 HE can hit something like supply trucks, for example, if you're a bit lucky, can actually destroy them. And this is the best 5 HE mortar available. The other choices would be Nona, both of which I don't like because they're expensive and don't carry a lot of ammo with themselves. Granted, I have a fob, but trust me, even a single Eurogun will, if bought early, can go through the fob on its own. So don't really want to resupply my mortars at the fob. The other option would obviously be the Tuncha or the Telak, but they all carry less ammo for the same price. Oops, tank I talked about before. I did consider maybe putting in a BV, which is effectively a better M2 Wilk, and the M2 Wilk is great. But then I thought, if I were to play Eastern Bloc and had the M84A, would I even use the M2 Wilk? And what does this unit do that the M84A can't? 17 armor, it's not a bad threshold by any means. It means that you will survive a 30 AP missile up front, assuming you're at full HP. But at the same time, if I have only 2 cards, this is a 5 or upweighted 4 per card tank. I can't think of many situations where I would buy this over the M84A. I might still want to try it out, maybe a card of upweighted T64BV and the card of downweighted M84A. But I feel that in the end I would buy out all my M84As, and only once I ran out of them, then I would buy the T64s. Still, maybe I should probably try this out. But this is the only other tank that I actually considered putting in. T80 is great and all, but outside of Armored, I'm not a huge fan of it. And it's a bit too niche to use, and it's bad at long ranges. Just straight up bad. And with the poor optics, not very self-sufficient. Everything else, obviously you have the heavier T72s, and they're all fine, but they're just too low availability, and maybe niche is not the proper way to express this, but I feel like, again, most of the time I'm just better off having the M84As, because there might very well be games or situations where the OBR is better, but I think there might also a lot more games where not having the M84As or not having as many is a much bigger issue than a much bigger negative than a positive in the other games where I have the OBR would be, if that makes any sense. Basically just a bare minimum of recon. I actually really found the alloy to be very, very useful. Cheap, very good optics. It's surprising how often the enemy seems to be incapable of killing this, because it's actually relatively far back, or the enemy can't afford to expose their AA. Obviously it gets one shot by LSCR and Erikoy, so that's something worth noting. But it's also just cheap enough to put it on flanks or something. And on Paddy Field, for example, if you're on the non-plateau side, it can so well spot everything that is on the plateau of your opponent from so far away without them being able to properly kill it. Yeah, I like it. Obviously, ideally, I would love to have the header with the rocket pods, the 30-point ones, but it's unfortunately a prototype. I'm very, very happy with this unit. Gotta have some recon infantry, of course. I wanted to run because usually you'd prefer shock, but I also considered having some regulars that are 8 per card instead of 6, because there were a few times where I did run out of Liren. However, having Liren that can fight decently and also have a good, for 20 points, a good anti-tank weapon, I found to be a lot more useful than having 2 extra infantry squads. And usually the alert is enough to make up for not having Liren everywhere. And then Sneska is just very solid for flank, for base defense, fire support, for front armor, good autocannon, very good little unit. Again, no speciality in the MI25, for example. Again, that's a very strong combination, very good, but you can very well say it does fill the gap that is being able to heal or drop somewhere, and that is true. But I just can't fit it in. So, it's not even too much of a niche unit. It's not really something that you have to have, but at the same time, it is very useful very often that it's not really niche. It's somewhere in between. Very useful to have, but also not quite must have. I would love to fit it in, but I just can't. I did consider not having a healer helicopter, but I felt that having a somewhat decent anti-tank helicopter is very, very important, because the MI25 obviously only has 16 AP. And the Polo, you could of course say, and maybe you will, maybe it is the right choice, take out the fucking Polo and put in another recon unit, Razzmann, or another tank. It's Polo though. And as you see, I have 1 activation point left, so I could just replace the Polo with a recon or tank choice of a tank unit of my choice. But the Polo is actually so. I'm on the brink of whether this is still a meme or actually just really good to have. Really good is maybe an exaggeration, but whether this is kind of a meme or actually better to have than another recon or tank unit. The thing about the Polo is it has 18 fucking missiles. These Malyutkas are not as slow as the Malyutkas on the BVPs, for example. These Malyutkas, you know, they have nothing to do with these anymore other than a very similar, or maybe even the same unit weapon icon. You know, other than that, it doesn't really have anything to do anymore. It has the same speed as a Tau 2. Obviously, it has a bit less range. However, it has 18 missiles. So if this thing wastes a missile on a fucking 5-pointer, who cares? It costs 35 points, it's dirt cheap, you get 10 of them. So you're never gonna run out if you up at them even. But the most important thing is actually, it has 6 missiles at the ready. It won't have to reload. Like this 20-second reload won't take place until it shot 6 missiles. If you look at the Bradley has to reload. I can't even talk. If you look at the Bradley has to has to reload after 2 missiles. If you look at the BMP-2, which Putin, for example, suggested using. Oh, hang on, I forgot that this one. Yeah. If you look at this, it has to reload after every single missile for 5 seconds. If you look at the BMP-3, it has to reload after every single missile for 6 seconds. The Polo will shoot, and then reload for 20 seconds. That is actually a huge deal. 3 armor means that if there's an enemy tank shooting at it at max range, it will need 21 AP to one-shot. This thing is the bane of medium tanks on stuff like Pettyfield and the like. At 35 points, it's also very cheap to just put it on your flank, and it will easily, most of the time, deal with IVs. With any IVs, it will one-shot Marder 2s. You know? Don't underestimate this little thing. It is very good. Yeah. Alright, VP, I think there's only really 2 choices here. I think anti-air helo, as nice as it would be to have. For one, the 24V isn't too great because it's expensive. And 2, it is, again, not quite niche, but also not quite a must-have. I have the Lasur, you know, for that role, and that is also more flexible to use for other things as well. And sometimes, even though you have an anti-air helo, a helo diver is still very important because anti-air helos are a bit slow if you want to react to an immediate longbow or tiger appearing somewhere on the map. VP over the and MR35, I think the 2 best choices here if you want a decent anti-tank helo. I did use the 35 before, but I think, especially since I use the FOB, I will keep the VP. The gun is most of the time better, although it only has a 5% stabilizer on the HE gun. It has extra rocket pods. It has better ATGMs. However, it only has 4. But since I have a FOB, that isn't as big of a deal. Yeah, that's all there is to say. I think if you're not running a FOB, MR35 might be a better choice, depending on what you need the helicopter for. But since I run a FOB, I think the VP is a better choice. The HOT is actually a quite underappreciated little unit. 40 points, also 22 AP, same stationary accuracy. Obviously less range, but cheaper, smaller. So it's not even that much easier to kill, actually, honestly, than a VP. Very little underrated unit. But I think I also just need the rocket pods and the guns on the Mi-24 VP. Air 27M MiG-29, basically the best ASF that you can get. Other choice would for one be this, but I said it before, the East German MiG-29 is not worth it. You only get 2 unhardened and you only get 2 medium range anti-air missiles, and that is not good for hardened. For one, they're not ripple fire like the Finnish MiG-29, which by the way is a prototype. I think. Honestly, if this little piece of it is prototype, okay. I wasn't sure. I don't want to be like, oh, I didn't even realize that's not a proto like the I-90. But yeah, I There's honestly not really a difference between having two medium range missiles and then being a fine frigate or some active. There's honestly not a very noticeable difference. You will notice difference if you get into the 3 or more missile range, like the KWS. But I think when you only have 2, the difference is not very noticeable. However, the Polish MiG-29 for one is cheaper and also comes at higher veterancy, 2, whereas the East German one comes at hardened. Yeah. Then again, 27M, self-explanatory. Backup ASF as well, very strong anti-tank plane. Not running the Syria because honestly, I don't think I will need many anti-tank planes anyways, and if I need one, I think the 27M just also being able to double as an ASF, since the MiG-29, the Polish one, isn't really the best one out there. Having a card to potentially help with, 2 armor planes if I need it is more useful. I did also get asked by whether I think the 25T would make the deck stronger. For one, I personally don't really enjoy using this plane, but 2, I think that you need a good amount of support units for the 25T. That means proper recon helos, ideally a K52, but obviously Mi-24K could also be useful, which I also considered using, but having my only recon helo be 110 points is nah. A proper recon helo, ideally the K52, because it has exceptional optics, but also stealth and anti-air missiles, so anti-air helos can't deal with it as effectively. Seed, a strong ASF lineup, etc., etc. Proper helicopters to also exploit the enemy not having an A or forcing them to shoot at your helos and then sniping you with a 25T. You need such units to make the best use out of the 25T, and I don't have these. So that's why I think in Redfor Unspec in general, unless you build it around the 25T, would be weaker with the 25T instead of the 27M, but also this specific deck that I built would for sure be weaker with the 25T. You could, of course, in theory, build a deck around the 25T with Redfor Unspec, but I think that would be... I think if your opponent manages to deal with your 25T, then you basically lost probably, because you need to spend so much of your AP, so much of your little AP for units that are mainly there to support your 25T, and then if you can't even use that, you don't have a whole lot of other units left in your deck. MiG-29 is a really flex card, I guess. I don't think I use it as much as I should. I did run the L15M before, but I felt the thing with the L15M, it's still a very great plane, but the main issue is that it will drop the cluster bombs first and then the HE bombs, meaning they won't be dropped simultaneously. So that means that the L15M dives into the enemy AA net a lot deeper than something like a J7H, like a Hawk 51? Yeah, like a Hawk 51 would. It does, however, have 20% ECM, which is great for 75 points, and it's fast, but that is something that should be noted. And the MiG-29 is also just more survivable, it has better turn radius, it has some short range missiles, so that if you have bought it already, it can double at being able to deal with helicopters, potentially planes if it gets into range, but only if you're desperate or already have it up in the air. It's a very good bomber, but I think I personally just don't use it as much as I probably should. It also rearms very quickly. Quickly. Man, I have to get done with this video and then drink some shit. Lazur, I think, should be obvious. Some people suggested it's 17k. I personally still prefer the Lazur, even though it might be, or I might be in the wrong here, but I think the Lazur might be a bit more consistent because this R60 Molière, the L17K, obviously has more accuracy and more HE. However, the Lazur has 1 second reload time, the L17K 2 seconds, meaning that very often the Lazur will be able to get 2 of these out at 1 helicopter, whereas the L17 will only get 1 of these out. I didn't do the math, mainly because you also have to factor in veterancy, etc., and size of helicopters. But you know, maybe it's just, maybe, you know, I'm wrong, and mathematically speaking, the L17K is more stronger. Maybe I'll just quickly do the math after this video. I don't know. And then of course the L17K also has more ECM, and in general it's probably better against planes. I don't know. I don't think, but don't think the difference is too big to very much notice. The other option would be the MiG-21 bis, but that comes either, there's like that's another thing. The Laser and the L17K come at 3 on veteran. The MiG-21 bis comes either 3 on hardened or 2 on elite. So it's either significantly more accuracy, but you get 1 less, or you get a bit less accuracy, but you get a much more survivable plane. And 2, hang on, let me see. Yeah, the AIM-90 is also worse than the R13M, but it gets the 1 second real-time 1 year as well. So it's a trade-off. You gain more survivability, but unless you take it on elite, in which case you also only get 2 per card, you're also less accurate. So the bis is another weird option. So it's really between these 3. I guess, well, I meant this, and the L70K. MiG-23 MLD is, of course, also an option, but I think the fact that these and the L7K have 2 sets of missiles that can be fired simultaneously is in general just a lot more useful than having only 1 set of missiles. So these are a lot more consistent, and the L7K. I also tried this for a while, but I think this is also a bit too niche. There's really not a whole lot of other planes to consider. Seed, of course, I tried a bit against Tech Beast Automatic, but I'm not using it anymore since I have the Eurogan. So, because if you know where the enemy AA is, you can also, you know, stun it with the Eurogan beforehand. J78 is also potentially a consideration. Maybe the Orao as well. I don't think I will use the L102, because I think if you really want to cancel out your opponent with 2 armor planes, and you want to use the L102, you should also use the 25T. Hawk 51 is also worth considering. You know, there are some options. Like I said, there's a good chance that, you know, every now and then when I play this deck, depending on how much I will play this, we'll see some different units or not. So, yeah. You probably already are sick of this deck for 5 months or something, but you might see, unfortunately for you, a lot more of this, or maybe you might not. I don't know. I can't predict the future. In any case, I hope you learned something. I hope you found it interesting. I hope I was understandable for 75% of this video, because apparently I can't talk properly anymore, if I ever could in the first place. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one.